Have you heard about Rider, a cross-platform .NET IDE developed by JetBrains and based on IntelliJ Platform and ReSharper? If not, it's time to give it a try. Develop .NET, ASP.NET, .NET Core, Xamarin, or Unity applications on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Get Rider today at rideride.net and try it for free for 30 days. That's rideride.net. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman-Taylor, and this is episode 32, Coravel with James Hickey. In this episode, I interviewed James about his open source library Coravel, which is based on the extremely popular PHP library Laravel. Some of you may know James from his blog, his community outreach over at Dev2, or his work on Coravel. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let this show begin. So, thank you ever so much for being on the podcast, James. I realize that it's early afternoon for you, mid-evening, I guess-ish for me. So I totally appreciate you taking some time out of your afternoon to talk to me this evening. So thank you very much to start with.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
So I thought before we get into the topic at hand, I thought we could maybe introduce yourself, talk a little bit about yourself so that the listeners know kind of who you are and where you're coming from and that kind of thing.
Sure. My story kind of dovetails into what we'll be talking about anyway, so it's a good way to introduce the topic. So I've been a software developer for over 5 years now. Right now I'm a senior developer, mostly doing .NET-based stuff. Right now I'm leading, kind of my big project I'm leading is a mobile app for the company I work for. And that, it involves a lot of like re-architecturing what's there and then building an API on top of that and the actual mobile, leading the mobile app stuff too. So that's kind of today. As far as kind of my journey, I have 2 years of college, and then after that, I started working right out of college into a ASPX web forms kind of project. So I got a lot of experience with web forms and C# and that kind of stuff, and JavaScript, and kind of over time, just got a lot of experience with pretty much the whole stack. About two years into my career, maybe two and a half, somewhere around there, I started getting interested in, doing side projects and things like that, or just playing with ideas. And .NET Framework, I don't want to say at the time, but still wasn't very easy to use to build side projects quickly, because you need like a Windows server and you need IIS and all that kind of big, expensive infrastructure to use .NET Framework. And this was before .NET Core was really popular. So anyways, I started exploring other languages and frameworks and actually tried to pivot, like get different jobs, actually like a front end. I almost got a job as a front end developer. And the only reason I didn't get that job is because there was like last minute, I discovered what some of the projects I would have been working on, and they were just like ethically not appropriate. So I kind of bailed on that. One of the big things that I discovered was Laravel, which is a PHP web framework. And it's just so easy to use. It kind of automates a lot of tedious, things you have to do over and over and over in typical web apps. I'm thinking authentication. It comes with an ORM that's really easy to use. And then it has kind of a lot of these really, really nice features like background task scheduling that's really easy to use. Queuing, it's kind of like baked in. You just tell it, okay, I want to queue using my database, or I want to queue using maybe some other queuing service or whatever. It's really easy to just kind of plug these things in. So yeah, at that point, I really loved kind of that ability to just rapidly build stuff and not have to worry about all that extra, kind of those cross-cutting concerns kind of things. So that kind of comes back to Coravel, and Coravel is kind of pieces of what are in Laravel, which is the PHP framework, that I wish would have been in .NET. And so it's the first thing that I kind of toyed around with and played around with was a task scheduler that was, similar or inspired by the way that you would do it in Laravel. And so that's kind of where that was birthed. It's kind of birthed out of like a career crisis where I was like, well, do I really want to continue with .NET or not? And then .NET Core kind of brought that back to life, kind of my interest in .NET. And anyways, yeah, .NET Core is fantastic, and it has a lot of stuff like dependency injection, for example, that Laravel has baked into it. So it does bring a lot of those things into it. But there's still a few features that I would have liked to have in .NET Core that weren't in there. So that was kind of my idea, was to just play around and try to add some of these little features.
One of the things I really like about the higher level languages and frameworks is that they take a lot of the ceremony away from these sort of important yet busy work tasks. Like you said there, Laravel has all of these things baked in. You don't have to spend weeks architecting. Whereas, as you were saying, .NET didn't have them. And I can't even imagine working in low-level C and C++ and building, say, a web server, or building, even starting from scratch and building a video game engine. I know that there's a YouTube video series that I follow called Handmade Hero, where it's an engineer who's been building a video game engine for about 3 years, and he does it in 2 or 3 hour snippets at a time and live streams the entire development. And I can't even imagine writing code that just draws a pixel on a screen. I did that back at university, but just having to hand engineer all of that, it just boggles my mind how much ceremony goes into all of these things. And projects like Laravel and Coravel and things like that are brilliant for this, because it just takes away all of that complexity, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And kind of from a business perspective, kind of the idea that why would you want to waste your time on solving problems that have already been solved, where you can just kind of have them out of the box and they've already been tested, they're secure, and those kinds of things. And then you can just focus on delivering like impact for your business, right? So you can focus on the core domain things that whatever your business does, and not have to worry about all that other stuff. So I think that kind of, mentality, I get maybe similar to like the agile approach or whatever, where you kind of just want to focus on what your business is doing and kind of be smart about what you're going to build and what you're going to buy, as far as off the shelf or whatever, things like that. But yeah, that's just it. As a software developer now in my career, I'm to the point where I'm still learning. We're always learning every day, and there's always so much to learn. But I know enough that I really want to focus on just delivering value to customers, making customers happy, improving the business. So a lot of those kinds of things. I think once you do get, years into your career, you start to get to a place where either you want to do that, or you just, you want to be a code monkey. I think there's kind of maybe a fork in the road that, many of us kind of take. So yeah, I'm definitely in the camp that I want to just help people and deliver value for businesses.
Definitely. I know that there's a quote, and I can't remember it offhand exactly, but there's something in both the Phoenix Project and the Go, which is what part of the Phoenix Project is based on, that essentially states that until the product that you're building. So the goal was originally written about manufacturing, and the Phoenix Project is all about, for people who haven't read it, is all about the process of why DevOps and why SecOps are a thing. And essentially the quote is along the lines of, until you get the product, whatever that product is, into the hands of the client, the customer, the user, whatever word you want to use, until it gets to that point, it's not making anyone any money. It's just a big time sink. So why not take away all of that busy work of gluing things together and building a task scheduler or building the code to draw a pixel on the screen? Take all of that away and just get something out to the customer first, and get that important first bit of feedback first. Because you'll always find, and I've said this many times, but you'll always find that, and I've said this for years, your client, your customer doesn't know what they want until you give them what they don't want.
Yeah, it's a good one.
speed that up, get the product to them quicker by using things like Coravel, Laravel, Hangfire, all these kinds of different projects. Use them as much as you can to get something out there first. And if you've architected your application well enough, you should just be able to dependency inject that library. So let's say you started with Coravel, or rather, let's say you started with Hangfire and decided, actually, I don't quite like this. Swap it out for Coravel without anyone even noticing, with maybe a couple of changes in some code base somewhere, maybe one or two commits, a pull request, bang, you've changed it all. Nobody's any the wiser.
Yeah, definitely. I think that whole idea, like it applies to so many different situations. I think people get tunnel vision, I mean, myself included, with that kind of thinking. So we think, to be agile, you have to use, let's say, microservices or whatever, right? It's easy to just kind of like grab this one, I think the term is golden hammer, where it's just like, this is the thing that I'm going to use to like fix all my problems every time, no matter what. It's like, you can be agile, and that's what led to the whole like serverless stuff and, functions as a service. Those tools are super useful to be able to just like put code in a function on the cloud, and then you can run it remotely. Like, that is fantastic. And, that is good for specific cases. But then on the other side of the like same spectrum, I guess, the agile spectrum, if you want to call it, you can still be agile with, running a monolith web app, right? Just like you said, if you're smart about how you architect it and what tools you use, you can still build fast. I've been in companies where I've done been a developer for like one product. And I've also been doing professional services where I've been doing a lot of like smaller projects. Yeah, and I've seen it quite often where it's like, okay, we're going to start a new .NET project and we're going to start from scratch. We're going to build our authentication from scratch. We're going to build, all the cross-cutting stuff from scratch. We're not going to like leverage anything we've done before. And yeah, I've seen that. And I mean, nobody enjoys that, right? Like, if you're a developer and you have to like start from scratch, and before you can even start attacking like the business problems, you have to spend 3 months like building your own little framework in-house. Like, yeah, I guess if you do it one time, it's fun, but then I have to do it over and over and over. It's not very fun. I've had to do it, and yeah, it's not fun. So yeah, I think these kinds of tools are awesome. And when you think of like functions as a service or microservices, those are definitely more like enterprisey things, I guess. Maybe not so much functions as a service, but definitely microservices. But Coravel, I think, at least the original intent was more on the other side of the spectrum for, let's say, individual developers. Let's say I'm just like, I want to start a new .NET Core app. Maybe I want to start a new business or whatever. Then I'm starting off small. I have a web app. I'm not doing load balancing, or I'm not, doing that kind of stuff. And I just have just a web app. But I do want to have some of these more advanced features like task scheduling or queuing. Like, for example, Coravel has caching too, and there's tools for making mailing simpler and event broadcasting, that you can do all that stuff in your simple, I don't want to say simple, but your monolith .NET Core web app. And you don't have to use RabbitMQ or have an event bus or a service bus and kind of all all that like heavy extra infrastructure that you think of whenever you think of like background scheduling, even caching, like Redis. Yeah, and like event broadcasting, usually you think of like, okay, having to do pub sub on like RabbitMQ or whatever. But you can do all that in memory and have it just, easy to use, right? So that's kind of what I really liked about Laravel, the PHP framework, is you can still use a lot of these really fantastic patterns, but you don't have to bring in like this huge infrastructure to use them. And like you said earlier, you can replace them later on if you need to. And I guess that's one of the benefits of dependency injection and using interfaces and stuff like that. You can easily just kind of replace stuff as you go. It kind of depends where you are, what your project needs are. And Coravel's at least intended for originally these kind of smaller projects that, you don't need like enterprise scale.
Even at enterprise scale, you could. I feel like you could still use something like Coravel to sort of cover those bases. The setting up task scheduling, and I mean, we'll mention it later, I guess, that it can handle hooking up to email APIs and things like that. All of that sort of, like you said, the queuing and all that kind of stuff. It sort of takes away all of the busy work of connecting all of those things together just to make it simpler to use. Like we said earlier, just get the product out to the customer. It doesn't matter how it all fits together. Maybe in the future we'll replace it, maybe not. And like you were saying there about having to write an entire authentication system from scratch. Well, like you said, it's fine until you have another project, at which point you might not be able to use the same authentication code. So you got to write it all again. And I keep saying it, but like you said, you're 3 months into the project and you've got nothing to show the customer yet. Maybe a few HTML mockups, maybe if you're really unlucky, maybe just a Photoshop PSD to show them this is what it will look like.
Yeah, I've been there, done that.
Yeah, it's not fun, is it? Just, this is what the system will look like. We've got a couple of JPEGs here, and maybe I can click this part of the JPEG whilst Jeff surreptitiously pushes next on his keyboard.
I've been on projects where it's like, okay, we need this new feature. We're going to demo it. We've already sold the idea. We're doing a live demo next week. We need you to just fake it, build the feature. It's just total front end, pretend it works. And then the person doing the demo knows exactly what pieces to click on.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous stuff like that. It's just, as a developer, right? It's just, that's demotivating for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you can leverage kind of these tools to just do away with all that and start actually building stuff. It's fantastic to be able to do that.
And of course, it can swing the other way where you build quite clearly a prototype. You keep telling everyone this is a prototype. It doesn't fully work. It's never intended to fully work. And then somebody sells that to someone and you're like, oh, okay, that's fine. But now I have to go and build the app. And they say to you, well, why? You have an app and it's running here. And you keep saying, no, it's a prototype. No matter how many times you press this button, you will always get the same response back. And then you get into trouble somehow.
I think once that happens a few times, you learn never to do that.
Oh, definitely.
Let's build a prototype, but let's actually have something robust underneath just in case, because it's bound to happen.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's only ever happened to me once where I'd built a Windows Forms app and I was told by my project manager, just do a prototype. Every time you push this button, just do the same thing. It doesn't matter. And then, it was only, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks later, I was receiving bug reports about how this product that we've paid for doesn't actually do what you've told us it will do.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, right. It happens. It's not a problem. I mean, you kind of touched on it earlier on, but what kind of things does Coravel allow me to do? What will Coravel do to take away that sort of procedure of setting up my application? The bells and whistles. What can it do that I could pull into an app today?
Sure. We can start from a high level, from the features, and then later on, if you want, you can even talk about how it's implemented and kind of some of the I guess lower level things that's going on, which kind of relates to .NET Core, because there's a lot of for example, the I-hosted service, which is new in .NET Core. This task scheduler relies on that, and it's just such an easy API to use. It's fantastic. So anyways, feature-wise, the first one that I started building, which at that time was just, I had no intention of actually having people use Coravel that much. It was just kind of a challenge to myself. Hey, can I build something like Laravel? Yeah, so task scheduling is basically, I have some kind of job or jobs in my system that I want to run periodically. Maybe it's every minute, maybe it's every hour, or maybe it's every Monday and every Wednesday, those kinds of combinations. So I kind of I familiarized myself with the way Laravel did it and tried to borrow a lot of those techniques with the way Laravel, as far as the API goes. So it's a very fluent API. So you think something like Link in C# that's a fluent interface. I guess the overall intent that I had starting Coravel, which is it shares that philosophy with Laravel, is just to make it super easy to do stuff. Like, for example, if you go to the GitHub repo for Coravel, there's a picture on the README of some code to schedule a task. And it's literally like, it could be one line if you want it, but it's 3 lines. So it's literally reads like scheduler.schedule, send daily reports, email job.daily. So it's very easy to read. And then the job itself is within that class that's in there. So yeah, task scheduling is that kind of thing. I ended up, when I finished it the first time, I posted it on Twitter, and it kind of blew up, I guess, if you want to put it that way. At least, from my perspective, it did. I was like, oh, okay, people are actually interested in this kind of thing. So I think I added the queuing feature. It's basically, so if you're in your web app and let's say you have a controller action, someone fills out a form and they hit submit, and part of this business process that you have to do in the back end involves doing some kind of like IO. Maybe you're like hitting an external API, or maybe you want to send email, which can take a while, a few seconds. You don't want your user waiting a few seconds to be able to get to the next screen. They don't really need the feedback to say, okay, we really sent your email. Usually you just want to put that on a background thread or queue it up, and then just return to your user immediately and say, okay, we did your stuff, but it's running in the background. So that's kind of what queuing is for, is you can do something in a background thread and it won't hang your request, so your user can just kind of move along. I'll go back to task scheduling. So after I created the queuing piece, I went back to the task scheduler and just totally rewrote it, because it was a first try just for fun, and people started actually using it. So it's like, okay, I need to make this a little more robust. So I ended up rewriting it, and so now there's a lot of like features, like you can prevent overlapping tasks. So let's say I have a job that I want it to run every 5 minutes, but for whatever reason, maybe my job is running a little slow, so it actually takes longer than 5 minutes to run. So what would happen in that case is, while that task is running and it hits that 5-minute threshold, in some cases, you don't want another instance of that job to start running because you already have one running. So there's a feature in Coravel where you can just say, I only want one instance running. If that is due to run again and it's still running, then just ignore it. Just keep it running and only keep one instance going. That's obviously very helpful depending on what you're doing. And then recently, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago, or 2 months, time flies, so probably a few months ago, there's a feature called schedule workers. So the way the scheduler works, because it's targeted towards web apps, is the task scheduler only runs on one thread, but it does everything async. So it's very efficient if you're doing asynchronous stuff. So if you're calling APIs and doing a lot of like database IO, your schedules aren't going to be blocking. So if you have like 10 jobs that are scheduled to run, but most of the time spent is just async IO, all of your tasks will run fine. They'll run efficiently. They won't be blocking each other. But in some cases, you might have tasks that maybe do some synchronous work. And in that case, they would be blocking all those other jobs. So if your first job starts running and it's doing synchronous stuff, like a lot of CPU heavy work, all the other jobs are going to have to wait for it to finish because it's only running on one thread. So the schedule workers is kind of a way to solve that. And basically, you can just tell your individual jobs to run on their own threads, or you can group different jobs. So I can have like 3 jobs, give them their own dedicated thread to run on, and maybe just leave all the rest on the main thread. And that's probably, I'd say that's more so helpful if you're building like a console app and you're using the scheduler. And I wrote an article last week about how to do that, just a really simple one about .NET Core 3 worker services. So I have an article there on my personal blog, how to use Coravel scheduling with worker services. And you can do that. You can, in that case, if you're using too many background threads, it could affect the HTTP requests that are coming in for your web app. If you're basically hogging all those threads that otherwise would be used to handle HTTP requests. That's not good. It affects your scalability. So yeah, typically you want to like do scheduling in a console app or something else if you want to go that route. Schedule workers lets you do that. Caching is another feature, and it's .NET Core actually has a really nice in-memory caching feature. I think the interface is iMemory cache, if I'm not mistaken. And Coravel's caching is basically just a wrapper around that. It just gives you a really, really simple interface to use. And there's like an extra feature that isn't built into the .NET Core interface that you can do. There's event broadcasting, which is basically you have like events and listeners in memory. So sometimes you might have some kind of like complex business scenario that you need to do. You can have an event like user created, and then you can have multiple listeners that you fire off whenever you broadcast that event. The event broadcasting is pretty great, not Coravel in particular, but just like event broadcasting in general using like an event-based, I don't want to say architecture, but pattern. It really helps to decouple your code. I think for developers who haven't used kind of an event-driven way of building apps, I would highly recommend it. It's a bit more advanced, but it's a lot easier to extend your app. So instead of having to like go into your classes and add some new code and muck around in what already exists, if let's say your business comes to you and says, okay, when the user is created, we actually need to send like this email, or we need to hit this API to like sync our user info with an external service or whatever. In that case, you would just build a new event listener and just say, okay, whenever this user created event happens, just fire off this new listener that I made, and you don't have to touch the other code that you've created. So yeah, it's really easy to extend your apps that way. And there's mailing, Coravel Mailer. And yeah, that is very inspired by Laravel's mailing feature. And again, it's just a lot of like easy abstractions to do mailing in your apps. So for example, you would have a iMailer interface that you would use dependency injection. You would get an instance of that, let's say in your controller. And Coravel has this concept of mailables, which is borrowed or stolen from Laravel. And a mailable is just a class that you create. And it basically it's a class that represents who you want to send mail to and the template for the mail that you send. And it's all encapsulated into one class. So I might want to say like mailer.send new user welcome email. And then I would pass my user into that class, and it would know, okay, I need to display the username or whatever in the email. But all that is abstracted away. So it makes your controllers really clean. So you just say, okay, I'm sending this mail. I don't have to worry about the details now. And the mailer is a bigger feature. It has a lot to it. So I guess if when you look at like the official docs, there's kind of a lot to it. It comes with some pre-built email templates, which is kind of cool. So if you can kind of just install it and start using it right away, and you will already have kind of a nice email template set up for you already. And you can configure it to use like a logo or whatever. It's kind of pretty easy to configure that kind of stuff, like a footer and a logo and all that kind of stuff. And of course, you can replace it with other kinds of things if you want. And like you said earlier, the actual interface uses SMTP. There's a way to kind of provide your own drivers. So if you want to use like Amazon's email service, you can just kind of call this method on Coravel, and as long as it uses the same interface that Coravel uses, the IA mailer, then you can just pretty much just plug it in and not have to change any of your code like you were talking about earlier. You can just switch email services pretty easy and not have to change any of your actual implementation code. And there is a CLI, which I haven't really done any work on for a long time, but there's a CLI that you can install as a .NET tool. And that's just kind of like an easy way to create some of these classes that Coravel uses. So like events and listeners, there's a command, I guess, that you can easily just say, okay, I want to build the new user event, and then here are my listeners I want to create, and then it'll just create all those classes for you automatically. Yeah, that's kind of the high level survey, I guess, of all the features.
I just want to hark back to something you mentioned about event-driven programming, because it's a wonderful system. It's a wonderful architectural design. One of the first big applications I ever worked on was essentially a system that we had these USB devices, and this was back in .NET 3.0 days, and we would communicate with the USB device, and it would use radio technology. Being suitably vague because it doesn't matter what technology it used. You could think of it as being dependency injected. And we wrote an app that essentially would communicate with the device, but it wouldn't long poll for a message. It would wait for a message to come in. And we built an event, almost like an event-driven system that we used delegates at the time. And we created this custom delegate. And we had, the first time you read through the code, it looked a bit like spaghetti code because there was no real entry point for these messages until you'd run it a few times. And then you'd send a message from the device, and then suddenly a breakpoint would fire because there was some event watcher set up somewhere in the system that would then go, oh, hey, this message just came in via USB. Here is the message. And it is wonderful. It's brilliant. It's not the same, but if you've ever done any like Windows Forms or WPF stuff and bound to a click or typing into a text box or ticking a checkbox or something, it's a similar sort of paradigm. As soon as the user hits that button or presses a key or whatever, the message is sent from the UI down to your business logic layer, which in a Windows form app is on the same program, but same sort of idea. And I guess the same with web forms. I've only done a little bit of web forms for a couple of months, but it's the same sort of idea, that sort of event-driven HTTP that, it served a purpose.
Yeah, definitely. And like with Coravel, each listener is an individual class, which, like you're saying, like web forms, for example, it can easily become like really messy when you just have a class that's full of all these different methods that handle events. So kind of, I like the idea of just having like one class that can do one thing. And if you need to do anything else, then you would create some new listeners or new classes in that case. And yeah, like this pattern is used heavily in like domain-driven design. Pretty much once you get into like any kind of like enterprise level systems or, that are done well, you start getting into event-driven systems. Yeah, like you said, it's hard to follow if you're not used to it. And just, I think probably the hardest part is that you don't have those concrete dependencies. Like you don't have a way to say, okay, this class concretely depends on this other class. In my IDE, I can hit F12 on this class or shift F12 in like Visual Studio, I think, and it'll show you like all the references where that class is used. But yeah, using an event-driven kind of pattern, you don't get that direct connection between classes. But once you understand that, yeah, it makes it so much cleaner to extend and even to understand, because then you have everything ends up being like a lot simpler, right? It's handling one thing, and if you need to do this other stuff, then you just create a new listener, and as opposed to just shoving everything into one class, which is very common.
Yeah, that single class with all of the functions and all that kind of thing. It's a bit of an anti-pattern, but sometimes you have to use it just to get the work done, don't you?
Yeah, if you're using web forms, you have no choice. I've never used WPF before, or any like those kind of MVVM frameworks. But yeah, even when you're looking at like front end frameworks like Vue.js or Angular, you end up having to create a lot of like individual methods to handle events. But definitely when you're talking about like business processes or business logic, doing that event-driven kind of stuff where each listener is an individual class makes a huge, huge difference.
It really does. Okay, you talked about the mailing and the messaging that Coravel does, and you said that it comes with a bunch of templates. Are the templates easy to set up? Is it just literally CSHTML, or is there some other sort of language you need to learn to use it?
Nope. Basically, when you install the mailer, so the mailer is a separate NuGet package than Coravel, because it does have dependencies on like the SMTP thing. I think probably some other stuff. Yeah, basically once you install it, I think by default, because there's two different templates, there's like a simpler one and then there's kind of a more fancier one. I think the fancy one is installed by default. It's just kind of out of the box installed. So basically the way it works is you create a Razor file, just like you would do in like creating any kind of like Razor view. And that Razor view has certain pieces of data injected. So Coravel does a lot of like I don't want to say magical stuff, but that's kind of, I want to put it that way, magical. I'll just use one example. So when you're building a mail, let's say for your like welcome user email, you create a class that inherits from this mailable class, and you have to implement a few methods on there. And the name of your class is actually going to be parsed by Coravel, and it becomes the subject of your email. So if your mailable is called welcome new user email, then it'll automatically make the subject of your email welcome new user. Of course, you can override that, but it does stuff like that. And there's other things that it'll inject for you. So basically, yeah, you just make a Razor file, like a normal Razor file, and you can use the viewbag, and there's certain properties that you can use, and go look at the documentation. And yeah, so you just basically build a Razor file, and you have access to, let's say if you want to inject your user, this is your welcome user email, you can inject your user into your template, your Razor template or your Razor file, and just output your user's first name or last name into your email wherever you want. And then in the class that you created, you just point it to whatever Razor file that you want to use for that specific email. You don't have to learn any new like templating languages or anything like that. It's still Razor. It's just that Coravel kind of handles all of that stuff around the outer shell for you. So that Razor view that you create will be injected into like the overall template. And so your like your header and your logo and your footer and all that stuff is kind of all done automatically for you. And each email, you just kind of have to code the body of it. And then you can have whatever data you want to inject in it, you can have Coravel do that for you. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of it.
Okay. You mentioned earlier on about it being sort of extensible, the mailing system. You said it can use SMTP, or you can, if you implement a specific interface, you can pull in an Amazon emailing system, for instance. I can imagine that perhaps there might be some system for using, Microsoft Exchange and things like that. But I was just wondering, and it might come across as a bit of a silly question, but can it be extended to use non-emailing systems? So, for instance, I know this week a friend of mine, Paul Seal, he released a new version of his Slack messaging bot that is now .NET standard compatible. I was just thinking maybe I could hook it up to that. Is that something that's possible? Can I talk to non-emailing system, or is the paradigm specifically for you will use the mailing system for mailing only?
You can if you want. The interface is definitely like email specific. So you'll have like a message, a subject, to, and even like a carbon copy and blind carbon copy. If you want to extend that to use some sort of API of any kind, you can. So yeah, if you want to do that.
Yeah, that's cool. I like it. Being able to extend a library or a system that I'm using. I like that. Rather than being sort of, what's the phrase? Not really trapped in the design of the system, but being able to sort of push those boundaries out a little, because you and I both know, and I'm sure the listener knows, that we build a system for someone and then they come along and say, that's great, but can it do X? And you say, well, it's doable, but I need to rewrite a huge amount of the system. And they'll go, but it's only a tiny change.
Yeah.
And I'm like, who's the expert?
Yeah. Laravel actually has like, they have a feature, I think it's called notifications, maybe. So it's kind of like a higher level on top of the mailing idea, where basically you can send notifications and you can kind of configure that to be like SMS or email or like Slack messages or whatever. That's not in Coravel, but that's definitely a feature that, if people ask for it, then I'll probably put it in. That's a very handy kind of thing to do. So yeah, probably just having like a much simpler interface that would have some like iNotification interface or whatever. I guess you wouldn't have like the blind carbon copy and carbon copy, those kinds of things. You wouldn't need those for like sending Slack messages probably. But you could use what's there if you wanted to.
Okay, so what we're saying is there's an open call to the community. Submit your pull request now.
Yeah, and like I've got other features that I'd like to build eventually, but it's a lot of work and I don't have much time. So if I see that people are interested in, there's kind of a common thing that people are interested in, then it gives me more reason to do that. For example, eventually, and I don't know when, but I'd like to add a feature to the task scheduler to basically make it a distributed task scheduler. So for example, if you're doing load balancing, you can just configure all of your jobs in your code. And Laravel has this feature, which is super nice. And basically, if server A, like you have two servers that are doing load balancing, if server A starts running your first job and then server B is starting to check the schedules, it won't run a job if it's already running on the other server. You know what I mean? So that's something I'd like to add. Obviously, that'll probably take a bit of work, but those kinds of things I'd like to add eventually. So lots of work to do.
That's the problem with these passion projects outside of work. They always take up so much of your time. I have a few that I work on. They're never going to be monetizable. It's just something that I want to do, and I think it was Will over at Complete Developer who'd said recently that, not everything you do has to be monetizable. As long as you can get something out of it, be it some kind of professional growth or some kind of new technology figured out or new paradigm figured out, then that's a net gain. Even if you just go down a path of, I wonder how this works. Why doesn't that work? Or can I do this? Figuring it out is a gain.
Yeah, definitely.
Exactly, right? So I've got a bunch of personal projects that I have just for learning new technologies, a couple of web APIs, a couple of little desktop apps, just a case of, I wonder how I do this in this technology, which is new to me. It's maybe not a new technology, but yeah, we all only have so much time, don't we, for working on these passion projects.
Yeah, and I've got a large family, so I probably don't have nearly as much time as most people have. But yeah, like that even applies to Coravel. Like when I first started building it, I didn't know that much about .NET Core. And it was definitely a way for me to learn a lot about .NET Core, which is why, like I'd mentioned, I ended up just totally rewriting the scheduler because I had learned so much about .NET Core and, how to do things right. So yeah, like you said, even if it's just to learn a language or learn how something works better, it's definitely worth the investment.
Most definitely. And 9 times out of 10, you can take that to something that you're already being paid to make. So a couple of years ago, I started looking into Docker to see how all of that worked. And then it turned out that someone at the company where I was working for at the time said, hey, why don't we learn Docker? And I just kind of went, hey, I know, I'll teach you. I could do this. And I ran a few, lightning talks or lunch and learns and just sort of taught people how to use it. And then 6 months before I left, all projects were using Docker just because it made things easier. It's not the be-all, end-all. It's not for everyone, but for the particular tasks that people were doing, it made perfect sense. So everyone sort of adopted it. And that's a case of, I wanted to learn how to do it. It was nothing to do with work, nothing to do with what I was paid to do, but, I wanted to learn it. And then it paid dividends.
Yeah, it's the same thing with Coravel because I was able to learn so much about .NET Core. Yeah, I was able to use all that knowledge like in the project that I'm working on right now. So
definitely. So with the task scheduler then, because I have a question about that. So is the system recoverable? So let's say I have a number of tasks that have been started. Are they persisted anywhere? I think we kind of touched on this a lot earlier on, but are they persisted anywhere? And if so, if my app crashes and I need to restart the server, can I load that queue of tasks back into memory and carry on from where I left off?
They're not stored anywhere because they're just run in memory using an I-hosted service. But there is a way to hook into there's these hooks for the task scheduler. So you can configure like an error handler for your tasks. Or you could just do it in your task if you wanted to do like a try catch or whatever. Probably relevant is, for example, if you have some tasks that are running and your app is shutting down for whatever reason, Coravel will keep that process running for you until all of those tasks are done running. For example, if you just try Coravel out on your own and just schedule something to run like every minute or whatever, but just hard code it to make it run for 5 minutes. If you try to do Control C and kill your process, you'll see like a console message saying, hey, you still have some tasks running. We're not going to shut down until they're done. So that's probably where the line needs to be drawn between like how robust you need your task scheduler to be. If you do need your tasks persisted for whatever reason, then probably not. You shouldn't look at Coravel. But yeah, if you don't need it, then it might be a good fit.
I mean, that's fair enough. We were saying earlier on, you only get so many hours in the day. And, this is essentially, I hope you don't mind me saying, but essentially this is kind of a in your own time passion project sort of thing. So you can't expect to be able to do everything. But then again, if you have a bunch of tasks and you need them to persist, maybe you should persist them. You know what I mean? Maybe it's a task left to the implementer, the user, to actually persist them somewhere.
Yeah. And there's an issue open right now for a feature so you can pass in cancellation tokens to your jobs. And that probably help with something like that. So for example, if the app is shutting down, then your job would get notified of it. So then as the developer, you can handle, maybe you're doing like a for loop that's hitting an API every time you do your for loop. And then you get your cancellation token saying, hey, the app's shutting down. Maybe you want to cut it off short and store your results. And then the next time that task comes around, pick up from where you left off. So that's a feature that I'm hoping probably going to be not next, but the one after that I'd like to implement. So that would address that kind of scenario. I'm not totally sure, like if you're persisting tasks, like if your app is shutting down, you wouldn't be persisting your whole, like your actual job. You'd be persisting the data that you've processed so far. So I think typically that would be up to the developer anyways. There would be like an automated way to do that. I think maybe Hangfire has a way to do that. I might be mistaken. But I mean, basically, yeah, it just comes down to getting a cancellation token. And whenever it's up, then you can choose to store what data you have and then pick up later next time the job comes around. Yeah, that's upcoming someday.
Fantastic. Well, like I said earlier on, get your pull requests in and let's see if someone can sort that out for you, figure out how to implement that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. So what about connecting with yourself then? How can folks get in touch with you, learn about the project, learn about what you do? What's the best way to do that?
So the project itself, so it'd be github.com/JamesMH/Coravel, and that would be the repo for the project. All the documentation is hosted on its own site. So if you want to check out the actual documentation, you can go to docs.coravel.net. You can check it out there. There's also like another project that I have going called Coravel Pro, which we haven't talked about. If you want to check that out, you can go to pro.coravel.net. And that's basically it's extending Coravel. And it's an administrator panel for .NET Core apps. So if you have a web app and you want to be able to manage your jobs visually from like an admin panel, you can fire off all your jobs using a UI. There's like a CRUD interface for your EF Core entities. It's in preview right now, but I'm working on it. And there's like health metric dashboard, stuff like that. So check it out if you're interested in that. As far as getting in touch with me, I'm on Twitter. What is it? JamesMH_dev, I think, is my handle. If you want to check out my website, it's jamesmichaelhickey.com. That should be enough areas for people to find me.
Brilliant. What I'll do is I'll make a point of putting all of those into the show notes. That way, people aren't furiously scribbling down what to do and where to go. I know that I've done that in the past where I've been listening to a podcast. In fact, I was listening to a podcast earlier this week. It was an episode of the InfoQ podcast. And there was some quote about security. And I was like, pen, paper, I'm not fast enough with my thumbs to type it into my phone. So I had to keep rewinding to hear it again, to write it down.
Nice.
So let's avoid that. Plus, each episode has, transcription. So people can look back through and just hear just how many times I say, and because I say them a lot. The only thing left to do, unless there's anything you want to bring up, James, is to thank you ever so much for being on the show. Like I said at the beginning, I appreciate that it takes an hour and a half out of someone's life to come and talk to me and listen to me say a lot and figure out what to ask people. So I really appreciate that. So thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it too. It's always fun to talk about tech, so why not?
That was my interview with James Hickey on Coravel. Be sure to check the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered and a full transcript of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for some more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.